Welcome to this special episode of Decoding Gender Insights from Thought Leaders. Population First is observing the 16 days of activism against gender based violence, a global campaign from November 25th to December 10th, with a 16-part podcast series that delves into the intersection of gender and critical social issues. Since inception in 2005, Population First has focused on challenging the gendered attitudes that devalue girls and women, fuel discrimination, and perpetuate gender based violence. Gender and media in India are closely linked, shaping societal views on gender roles. While traditional media often reinforced stereotypes, digital platforms and advocacy for equality have fostered more empowering portrayals. Women are now visible in diverse roles, though challenges like objectification and limited leadership persist. Joining us in today's episode to shed light on this critical issue are two distinguished experts. As an author and editor, veteran journalist Kalpana Sharma has always used a gender lens to look at issues long before it came into vogue. Radhika Baudia has worked as a television journalist for over 20 years. She has always kept a firm focus on gender in her in-depth reportage. Over to the experts.
For us, we were in television. By the time we came into television, some very important battles, we had a sense some very important battles had been fought already for us by an older generation. Of course, when I say those battles were fought, there were a lot of issues that remained and were urgent, and other issues that were emerging. But let's say for me in television, I was in an organization where there were lots of women. Things like a women's loo or very basic things that we used to read of earlier were not things that we faced. There were a whole set of other challenges. So what I have actually really been wanting to do is to do a long interview with you.
Okay. So I've also seen your work, and when all of you young women burst onto the media stage through television, which also gave you much more visibility. I mean, this is the thing about this is different. I'm a print journalist and remain that, and I'm also part of the typewriter generation, which means that the time at which we started writing, when our mugshots did not appear as they do now. In many newspapers and print media, and of course digital. So people did not know who we were. They may perhaps seen our byline. We also didn't get bylines, by the way. You wrote extensively, but it's only if it was really something unusual that, the editor thought it was worth giving you a byline. So journalists...
So the stories went, even your own stories went without bylines.
Special correspondent, staff reporter. I mean, I covered, for instance, the 92-93 riots when I was with the Hindu. We were just two of us covering it. But neither of us got bylines. So nobody knew which story I had done and which my colleague had done. And I traveled the length of Bombay. And that is the time I really discovered many parts of my own city, which I had not seen. But that's the tradition that print media used to follow till that change took place in the 90s, where media houses also began to think about profit, led by, the leading group in print media. And everybody else followed that trajectory. And that is when journalists started getting their own profile, which I think also helped in access, because when you're trying to access, say, a bureaucrat, and he or she has read your story, then, they may be willing to talk to you. But for instance, when I joined the Indian Express, I used to write editorials, which are unsigned, and occasionally an edit page piece. And I would go and try and meet a bureaucrat for the stories that issues that I was interested in, like the environment. They didn't know who I was. I had to literally produce proof that I was with the Indian Express, even though I was an assistant editor. This is what I'm trying to say. This is the difference between today, when journalists themselves have profiles, thanks to television, but also print, to a time when we were like the anonymous work bodies, who produced that newspaper. And the only ones with bylines were the editor and those who wrote on the edit page, and some very special correspondents.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, because I feel that in many ways, the importance of the byline, the visibility becomes important, especially when you've had a large number of women who are reporting, and again you have add another layer of invisibility to them. But on the other hand, what I've also seen in television is that it was a double-edged thing, because it also did become a little more about credit and about the person and the profile, and a sort of slight move towards celebrity journalism. And I think that kind of leads us to what we were talking about when we were speaking yesterday on the phone, which is, how technology changes a lot of what is also emerging in terms of ideas, and in that, where do women get placed? But I saw both. I saw the huge advantage of having that profile of knowing that you are Radhika Bodia approaching a collector, DM, NDTV, but also seeing this sort of sense of, am I being visible enough? And that idea of somewhere celebrity journalism, which I think is still stuff that we need to keep debating. What it
Yeah.
actually did to journalism, good and bad.
Yeah. So yeah, I think you're right. I think from the time that Amu Joseph and I, for instance, did our study on women's issues in the media, to today, there have been 3 or 4 very drastic changes, so that we cannot use the same lens today to speak about gender in media as we did then. One is, I think, the main thing to me is the whole commercialization and corporatization of the media. Media houses were owned anyway by big business, but big business had not consolidated the way it has today. And also the nexus between big business and politics, though there was always a relationship, had not reached the point it has today. So I think that is the very major factor where news has become something that sells a product. Whereas for us who came into journalism in the 70s, it was some idealism, some belief that, the fourth estate is part of democracy and you're supposed to speak truth to power, and that is the role of the media. I mean, that has completely gone out of the window, actually. It's become commercial. The second thing is, as you said, technology, which I think is a very big change, which certainly people from the so-called legacy media, I think we haven't got our head around it. And technology, not just in terms of television, which has been there long enough for us to understand it, but the whole thing of the internet and now social media. And I think the third thing is that even though, in terms of numbers, at one point we used to think that more women in the media would make a difference. But this is what I'm saying, even though there are many more women in the media, in the legacy media, the glass ceiling has still not been broken. There's not yet, in the English language media at least, a single woman who's become the editor of any of the major papers, except the Hindu, which is family owned. In the Indian language papers, there has been a little bit more progress. But the women who work within those media still face the same problems, even though their numbers are much larger. They may not have to fight for a toilet, but certainly sexual harassment, as we know from the Me Too movement, even fighting to get certain beats, that still continues. It's not automatic that you can get the political beat or you can get defense, for instance. Women still talk about having to fight to do what should be just decided on the basis of competence and not your gender. So I think these are the 3 things we have. So now if we put our lens down and look at gender in the media, we're looking at a different creature altogether. When we say media. In fact, in my days, we never used to say media, we used to say press.
Yeah.
Because it was the print, right?
Press
And when television came in, we just started talking about media. So I think this is something that still has to be done. I don't think enough thought has been given on what we're talking about when we say gender in media.
In fact, I mean, you mentioned Me Too, and I'm sort of closely in touch with a lot of print journalists in the Hindi newspapers in Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh. And they say that they were very hopeful with the Me Too movement, because in some ways the sort of patriarchal hold of the newsroom in some of their newspapers, when they describe their experiences, and almost all of them still obviously want to do it anonymously, is you're talking about absolutely sort of basic violations on a daily basis, which is normalized. And they were very hopeful with the Me Too movement. But many of them now express the fact that it hasn't actually changed their working conditions. It's been turned into a joke by their male colleagues. On the other hand, when they want to report on a Me Too case, their editors are very happy that they can report on a Me Too case. Um, and and I think that's again something that needs some level of discussion, because I feel that some of the ways that they are pushed into reporting Me Too is details of what happened to the woman. And so there is a salacious aspect of it that an editor, a male editor, is pushing a reporter to do. Whereas all of that, which is still issues, labor and gender, those are issues they get no space for. So even how Me Too is unfolding seems to me somewhat problematic when I hear their descriptions. These are more sort of experiences that I've heard from other women than faced myself. But it is something that I think is worrying.
Yeah. I think the other continuum that I have noticed is the whole issue of reporting on violence against women, right? From a time where, the Mathura case led to the autonomous women's movement demanding changes in rape laws, end of 70s. In the 80s, as a result, as Amu and I documented, newspapers had to take note of that, as well as the dowry agitation, and produced, reports and articles. But the one thing I have noticed in these years, which I've written in this other book, The Silence and the Storm, that when it is something in an urban area, like the Delhi incident in 2012, the recent RG Kaur in Kolkata, then the media, of course, writes, but also with this salacious interest. I think it was 2007 or 8, I can't remember. In Bombay, there was a issue of sexual assault on a student, and one of the major papers in Bombay actually published the FIR, which should not have been a public document because it had not been presented yet in court, just for the salacious interest. And that continues, whereas we know for a fact that the space where women experience the major part of their violence is in their homes. Domestic violence far exceeds, first of all, stranger rape, and secondly, even rape by people known to the survivor. That's one factor. The other factor, which I've argued all along, is developmental policies, environmental policies are a form of violence against women, because it's women, and often poor women, who pay the biggest price in terms of their health, in terms of the burden of work that they carry because of these policies. And yet we in the media don't even notice it. And therefore, I've argued that when we talk about gender in media, we have to feminize or genderize, we can say, our reporting. The media needs to get its head around the fact that part of your equipment as a journalist has to be understand how society mediates gender. If you don't understand that, then what you're writing, what you're reporting is incomplete, because you have not understood that, and your eyes have not seen what is in front of you.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. I think I've often been described, by people that, oh, she does women's stories. And initially I would be wanting to tear my hair out and rave and rant against that labeling. But over the years, you sort of say, okay, well, whatever. But I feel that a lot of what is that push towards being able to look at society holistically and therefore bring that lens to any story is something that I almost feel sometimes we're regressing. And that ties into the earlier point about the rapid commercialization. And I think right at the outset, we should have had stronger rules on who can own media, who can actually, I think Britain still has some laws which are very useful. But this sort of cross ownership that we have in our media today is a huge problem that feeds into a certain commercialization, that feeds into an existing sense of, for lack of any better word, patriarchy, and so on the one hand, with technology, you have some changes. I know the digital portals. I think there was a UN Women and News Laundry report a few years ago that said that editors in the digital space, women editors, are increasing. I think it was sort of 5% for the print or some 26% in digital portals. So whether it's a Seema Chishti at The Wire or prominent journalists like Supya Sharma at The Scroll, there is still some move in that direction. But when it comes to the mainstream media, and I think we have to recognize that while a lot of very good journalism is being done by the digital sites, the coverage, the sheer number of journalists on the ground is something that they cannot compete with, and news is still being made by the mainstream media.
Yeah.
And so we are still, I feel, dealing with some of the same fundamental problems as well. And things like gender sensitization. I mean, there have been so many efforts, but that has to happen editorially. And I think that's where we're stuck.
Yeah, I think both editorially and in journalism training. I mean, I really think that, the whole system of how we train journalists. By the way, whenever I've spoken to journalism schools now, out of a class of, say, 35, one person will raise their hand saying they want to be a journalist. All the others want to go into PR or advertising. This is the reality now, because journalism is not drawing people into the trade the way, I think idealism of the kind we had is gone. But even as a career choice, it seems to have diminished hugely in the last 10 years. It's one reality, because everybody can be a journalist now if you have a phone,
I have taught earlier at Jindal, and classrooms full of students who are there for a journalism course. They have a curriculum which has, gender and reporting, caste and reporting, but their interests really lie in the PR. And they say that their parents are, and a sense that their parents are paying for an education, and therefore how will they earn? So there's a viability issue in journalism, because they're now seeing colleagues who are making much more money in the corporate sector, a sense that journalism will never, should also, if you're doing it right, cannot be making you that kind of money. And so that sense of idealism and that passion, I mean, I'm sure every generation feels it diminishing. I certainly feel it also now, after sort of 20, 25 years in journalism. But I also feel that there are a lot of younger journalists who are passionate and who are working, whether, I mean, I meet a couple of journalists from Caravan or via print or independently, and they have that idealism. They're working with a tough political climate. But opportunities for them. We were, a lot of what we learned was because there were budgets to travel for a story. And when you're out on the field, there's a kind of learning that just cannot come in any other way.
Yes.
And so I do feel that for younger journalists and younger women, it is also a very tough landscape, despite some of the positive changes that may bring more visibility. Because there's also a sense that their story is not having will it have an impact? I think we still felt that, whether it was, if we push and we do a sustained reporting on, let's say, something like the ICDS, the Integrated Child Development Scheme, or maternity rights, you felt that there was perhaps a pressure we were building. I feel that younger journalists don't feel they have that space.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this visibility is really a double-edged sword, especially, as I said, in the new understanding of what we mean when we say media. So, as women, prominent women, and including women journalists who are visible, are targets of the worst kind of misogyny on social media. And you have to be pretty tough to be able to withstand that day in and day out. Within that group, Muslim women, for instance, Muslim women journalists, whether they're with print or television or digital platforms, have talked about how much more difficult it is for them today in the current atmosphere, where they're targeted both on social media and often not given the access which they had presumed they would get because they're journalists. So I think the violence that women are experiencing now, because of this transformation of the media into this new creature, which we are still getting our heads around, is something I think we have to address now when we talk about violence against women or gender in the media, because it is very much integrated into this larger, um, society that we're developing into in India. I mean, it's around the world, but in India particularly. I think for the future, these are things we have to take on board when we think about it, because it's not just television and newspapers anymore. It
No.
really is this whole world out there where the young women who I really admire, the way they're entrepreneurs, the way they manage to get stories and write such fantastic stories from very difficult areas like Manipur, for instance. It's been these independent young women, independent journalists who've done the best stories from Manipur, which mainstream media has just abandoned. So, these are all future things that we have to, I think, all of us who are concerned about this issue must start putting our heads around it.
Yes, because I mean, it is absolutely brutal. And you're right. I mean, if you look at the best reporting, I mean, right through the pandemic, right through some of the worst conflict areas, even Kashmir, Manipur, there have been women journalists. A lot of them are completely committed and they're working against the odds. They're doing it on their own. They're doing it on shoestring budgets. They're doing it because they really want the story to be told. And then you face the kind of trolling, open death threats, open rape threats, and a sense that where is the redressal? I mean, do we, how can we sort of lobby to try and bring this a little under control? Because to to have a space where this can be said openly and have no legal or I mean, it's not possible for everyone to chase each troll. But I agree. I mean, I think maybe perhaps have some sort of a focused sense of how one can take this on. Do we do it legally? Do we do it because I mean that
We should consider, we've talked about it amongst many of us women
sure.
journalists, that maybe we should set up some kind of coalition of lawyers, senior journalists, and others who can be available, especially for these younger independent journalists who are going out in the field and reporting and what they face. So they know there's a one-stop, number that they can reach, and then it can be worked out who will support them. Because if you're working for a media house, at least that is there. But for many of them, they don't have a backup, even if they're writing regularly for certain media houses. And I think there's no option. We'll have to, conceive something of that kind to protect these women.
I
Even
think
then, it's not, guaranteed that they will be protected, because it's really vicious out there,
yeah.
and it is so organized, the kind of attack that takes place on
Yeah.
anyone who questions. When you're a woman who questions, the powers that be, or write something that they don't like, it they come at you, as you said, in all ways, in a way that I don't know. I have not experienced it, and I don't know how my head would get around it if I was the target of that kind of attack.
Yeah. And as you say, and often with a very sort of trenchant communal angle to it as well. But I mean, I think that it is something that a lot of young journalists talk about and have expressed themselves. And so I think, yeah, I mean, if a organization or something like that can be formulated, because actually, even within media houses, um, you know, women aren't getting that kind of support for what is being said.
Yeah.
And so I think it isn't as if there is that level of sensitivity within media organizations. Not all media organizations are the same, but a lot of testimonies from within mainstream media also, where I definitely know in Delhi a lot of the Hindi newsrooms in television where women have come out, some have spoken and have actually lost their jobs. So for just speaking out against the culture. But yeah, I mean,
And,
You know,
the ones who are even more vulnerable than those of us who are in the metro cities are those who are in the smaller towns.
Right.
And of course, in rural areas, there are, that is the other thing that amazes me today, is there are independent women journalists based in Bodoland and, these kind of places where there's no backup for them. And yet they're managing to survive, doing their stories, trying to figure out how to get the information out through social media, through any other way, through contacts. That is remarkable, actually. So technology has helped them, but they are horribly vulnerable because economically they're vulnerable because they don't have, assured incomes. And if they cross a certain line, they can be targeted in a very direct way, both physically and through social media. And I think there's no real recourse because I don't think there's a faith that, somebody will look out for them. But that's why I'm saying it's even more remarkable that they still do that. So I've not lost hope, because I just feel every generation still produces the men and the women, and a lot of them are women now, who understand what journalism should be about and are going about doing that, irrespective. And their hurdles are much greater than certainly what we faced, much, much greater.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting how one set of battles are fought and a whole new set of battles now emerge in a completely different media landscape. And I think that, again, I agree with you. I mean, the number of young women who are there and reporting and doing really, really solid journalism and powerful stuff is quite incredible. I just wish that it was. I do feel somewhere that at least for the first 10, 15 years of my career, we were very cushioned. And there was some learning that came from the cushioning. There were probably other things that didn't happen in the way that they necessarily should have. But on time, Yogesh. But one of the things that I have often sort of grappled with is this idea of hierarchies in news. And we've often said that women were given sort of lighter beats. I actually have a problem with the nomenclature of what is a heavy and what a light beat is. As someone on the field who wasn't television was not as beat fixed as print was, and one of the things that always made me very interested was this fact that we believed that someone who was doing party politics as a woman was breaking a glass ceiling. And I wondered whether we were working with false glass ceilings, because frankly, party politics as a television journalist was the easiest thing to do. You go sit around in a couple of offices in Ashoka Road and you make your contacts and you go do them. And here you are, admired as a woman journalist in politics. Similarly, if you're doing the, foreign affairs, you're again breaking a glass ceiling. I've been on a MEA trip with Vajpayee to Lahore, and I was amazed at what it involved. It involved an itinerary, two foreign secretaries pompously speaking on both sides, notes, and I mean, really, we know that there isn't going to be some great information, and the analysis, but that was seen as breaking a glass ceiling. Going into the field, reporting on maternity rights, reporting on nutrition for women, these were seen as features. And our features desk consisted only of women. My contention here is that I think we're working with false glass ceilings in journalism. I don't think it's the priority we have placed on what is a harder beat that to me is a problem.
Radhika, I'm so glad you brought this up. This has been my pet peeve for the 50 years that I've been a journalist. Because I've always argued, as you say, actually, those are soft beats because they require no work. Whereas I, for instance, was interested in environmental reporting. That is really hard work. You have to go out there, you have to see for yourself. You cannot do the kind of environmental journalism being done today based on reports, secondary. I mean, climate change, you've got to go out there and see what is happening and report on it. Where is the reporting on that? Nobody's doing it, but that's the kind of reporting. Developmental issues, whether it's education, whether it's sanitation, whether it's water, cannot be written unless you go out and talk to women, especially to understand what is going on. And this hierarchy that is created it's a male hierarchy that was created. Radhika, the hierarchy was in print to begin with, and I think it's a male conceived hierarchy, which unfortunately, as women, we have not been able to bust it because we have bought into it.
That's
And bought into it. So the women who make it become, in a way, they take in the same, it's this proximity to power and importance without actually thinking that you have to turn this on its head. And I think that is really essential.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because this is very personally felt. And, and it sort of bothered me that the features desk was largely women, and it was features, because I'm like, wait, this is a problem here. But I think in all fairness, in where I worked, at least, there was a lot of attempt to break those hierarchies in the placement of news. Some positions were given, but that labeling was very personally felt. So I'm really happy to have the support, and I'm using this opportunity to say we've got to do that interview with you.
Thank you, Kalpana Sharma and Radhika Bodia, for the insightful and thought-provoking conversation on gender in media. Viewers may share their reactions, queries, and observations in the comments section below. Please watch all the episodes, and we hope that this initiates gender conversations in your family, along with your friends, colleagues, and community members.